Let's focus first on the epidermis, made of stratified squamous epithelium. Being stratified squamous epithelium, the epidermis is made of a number of layers of cells. We have many, many, many layers of cells in the epidermis. Most of those cells are called keratinocytes. That's the main cell that we find that makes up the epidermis. But we see other things as well, and there are some differences depending on how deep or superficial we are in the epidermis. So we're going to look at 5 different areas of the epidermis, beginning with the deepest and moving up towards the more superficial. If we look down at the very bottom of the epidermis, we have a layer of cells called the stratum basale. This is really where all of the epidermis comes from, because the cells in the stratum basale are the cells that are undergoing mitosis. These cells are undergoing mitosis and constantly dividing to make more cells. As the cells of the stratum basale divide, they push the older cells upward toward the surface of the skin. Any sort of damage to the skin or repetitive stress to the skin stimulates more cell division. So the more you use a certain patch of skin, the more cells will divide, and the thicker the skin gets in that area. That's how people can form calluses. If you do a lot of work with your hands, the area of the skin that's constantly under stress will have cells in the stratum basale that divide more frequently to replace those cells, and the skin in that area gets thicker and forms a callus. If we move up a little bit from the stratum basale, we get to the stratum spinosum. The stratum spinosum is made of layers of live keratinocytes. The main job of a keratinocyte is to produce keratin. So these cells of the stratum spinosum are live cells, and they're working really hard to make a lot of keratin. Once we move up to the next layer, we get to the stratum granulosum. And the stratum granulosum, our keratinocytes are beginning to die. At this point, they're a little separated from the source of their nutrients, and so these cells begin to die. And when we look at them, we can see that they look a little bit speckled. These are the granules full of keratin inside those cells that we can see. If we go up a little bit further, we get to a layer called the stratum lucidum. And the stratum lucidum only occurs in areas with very thick skin, like on the soles of the feet. So we'll skip that and go right up to the stratum corneum. The stratum corneum is the outermost layer of the epidermis, and this is made of dead keratinocytes. All the actual cells are dead, and all that's left are these layers and layers and layers of keratin. We saw this as a surface specialization when we were learning about epithelium, a tough layer of keratin proteins on the outer surface of the epithelium. Now we know that those layers of keratin are actually what's left behind after the keratinocytes die. As I mentioned before, most of the cells of the epidermis are keratinocytes. We have keratinocytes in all those various layers. And the role of the keratinocytes is to produce keratin, and that keratin provides toughness to this epidermis of the skin. But there are other cells in the epidermis as well that have important roles. For example, we have cells called dendritic cells that are found in the stratum spinosum, in that live layer of keratinocytes. And these dendritic cells are important because they are the macrophages of the epidermis. We're going to see a lot of macrophages in anatomy and physiology, and the role of a macrophage is to engulf or phagocytize particles and debris, bacteria or viruses, basically things that don't belong in that area. And so to help protect the epidermis, we have a number of these dendritic cells that sort of branch out, and they watch the epidermis for anything getting in that doesn't belong. And if it does, they will phagocytize it to help protect the deeper layers of the skin. They're also important for activating the immune system. So if something that doesn't belong gets into the epidermis, these dendritic cells can find it, phagocytize it, and then activate the elements of the immune system that are necessary to fight it. The epidermis also contains the tactile cells, sometimes called Merkel cells, that provide our sense of touch. So a light touch to the epidermis will be detected by these tactile cells. that are connected to a neuron that will send the signal to the brain to tell you that something is touching the skin. These are found in the stratum basale. Also in the stratum basale are the melanocytes. Melanocytes are important cells that are found in the epidermis that produce melanin. Melanin is the pigment responsible for skin color. The actual color of your skin depends on a number of factors, including the type of melanin released. There's more than one type of melanin, and some are darker than others. It depends on how much melanin is made. The more melanin produced, the darker the skin. And it depends on how long the melanin lasts. If the melanin is long-lasting, then it can accumulate and cause a darker skin color than if it's broken down quickly. The functional role of melanin is not just to color the skin. The importance of melanin is that it provides protection from UV light. Melanin protects the DNA in the keratinocytes from damage due to UV light. The melanin is produced by the melanocytes that then release the melanin into the epidermis. The keratinocytes take in the melanin, and they use the melanin to produce a protective layer over their nucleus. Exposure to UV light stimulates more melanin production. That's how you get a tan. As your body is exposed to UV light, the melanocytes recognize that. They produce more melanin that can be brought into the keratinocytes to provide a thicker layer of protection over the nucleus to prevent further damage. The downside of more melanin is that the more melanin you have, the more protection against UV damage, the harder it is to get UV light through the skin to produce vitamin D. So again, we have a balance between protection from UV damage, but allowing UV to convert cholesterol into vitamin D. This slide gives us a look at the actual histological differences between skin of different colors. In people with very dark skin, their melanocytes produce a lot of melanin. That melanin is a very dark color and it's long-lasting. And it's very easy to see where the melanin is collecting down in the lower level of the epidermis. We can see that the cells here all along the stratum basale are getting very dark from the protection they're getting from the melanin. In light-colored skin, there may still be patches of melanin. There's some melanin, but it certainly doesn't accumulate to the same degree. And we don't see that same dark layer at the bottom of the epidermis that's providing the protection from the UV damage. Evolutionarily, we can see that the change in skin color from the ancestral state of dark skin, ancestral humans had very dark skin, which was very important to protect them from the UV light in the areas of Africa where humans originated. There was a lot of exposure to UV light, and dark skin was very important to provide protection from that UV light. As humans began to move away from Africa and move up into more northern areas where there was less exposure to UV light, the problem was that it was harder to synthesize vitamin D. And so skin colors became lighter to allow more UV to penetrate in order to produce the vitamin D. And you can see that in general, as a trend, when you go to areas with less and less UV exposure, you end up with lighter and lighter skin color. As you go to areas with more and more UV exposure, you get darker skin colors to provide the necessary protection. There's one more important feature of the epidermis I want to discuss before we move on to looking at a different part of the skin, and that is the epidermal water barrier. The epidermal water barrier is a waterproof barrier that forms between the stratum spinosum and the stratum granulosum. And this is what prevents our internal fluids from leaking out and what prevents us from sucking up water if we are taking a bath or going for a swim. There are three components to this epidermal water barrier that creates this waterproof area of the skin. First, we have tight junctions between the cells. We talked about this before. A tight junction sort of zips two cells together so that nothing can leak between them. So tight junctions are an important component of the epidermal water barrier. Second, in this area of the skin, we have a lot of lipids being secreted to the outside of the cells. And remember that water doesn't like to interact with lipids. So if we've got a layer of lipids here between these parts of the epidermis, it's going to be really hard for water to get across there. The third component is a layer of insoluble proteins inside the cells. And these proteins provide one more layer that make it difficult for water to get across. Between these three components, the tight junctions, the layer of lipids, and the layer of insoluble proteins, water can't get out or in the epidermis. Water can't get out of the body or into the body past the epidermis. However, this barrier that prevents water from getting in or out also prevents nutrients from getting to the more superficial layers of the epidermis. So all of the nutrients, the water and the amino acids, the glucose, the vitamins that come from the blood vessels in the dermis work their way up through the layers of the epidermis, but they're stopped by that epidermal water barrier. So that means the cells of the stratum granulosum and up have no access to a nutrient supply, which is why those cells die and eventually become the stratum corneum.